Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. In this episode of the Farmall Super C Restoration, we're going to get the engine back on the rear half of the tractor, put the head on the engine, get the top of the engine all closed up. But before I can put the engine back on the tractor, I got to take it off the engine stand, got to put the flywheel on, and I have a new clutch. Before I put the flywheel on, I got to replace this soft plug. This is the coolant gallery here. I pulled out the old soft plug to clean everything out. Lacquer thinner. I use Permatex Ultra Black, a silicone, to seal or give extra insurance for these soft plugs, just a ring around the outside. Then this soft plug is curved, of course, and that's what sets it in place. And then flatten it out a little bit so that it pushes against the edges. And put a little bit more Ultra Black against the outside, just as extra insurance. Next, I'm going to replace this pilot bearing or bushing in here in the end of the crankshaft. This is what the end of the clutch shaft seats into, and a new one came with my clutch kit. So we're going to use a blind hole puller to get behind that and pull it out. It expands behind the bushing. Get it set. Then a slide hammer threads onto the end of that. Okay, well that isn't working. We'll put the puller on this way instead. This is the Happy Fun Time blind hole puller off of Amazon. It ain't the best quality, but I don't use it very often, so it is what it is, I guess. You go back on. That's the old bushing. Put a 70-year-old grease in there. Yucky. There's a well in the back of the crankshaft to hold a little bit more grease to help lubricate things. We got everything clean down in there, and this is the new bushing that goes in. And that bushing seats on the end of this shaft here, the clutch shaft, and I've got a good fit here. You can oil up that hole and oil up the outside of the bushing, and then use the bushing driver to set that in. We got to pack this with grease in the well behind. There's no way to grease this once it's together. There's no grease fitting or anything. Next to go on is the flywheel, and I had Mr. Richards turn the face on this. It was really in bad shape. And he also turned the step down here so you maintain the same distance between this face and this face for the clutch to work properly. The other thing to note is the timing for this engine is on the flywheel. So if I turn it around here, I don't know if you can see that, but there's a line right there and it says DC 1-4 there, dead center, pistons 1 and 4. So we'll put a dab of paint over that before we put everything together so that that is visible. And the flywheel is kept in proper time to the crankshaft by this pin that sticks out from the crankshaft. So the flywheel can only go on one way. Give these a little zip with the impact wrench because the crank wants to turn when you tighten on them. Take care of these locks here. Now let's check this timing mark. Right there it is. And at top dead center it's actually all the way 180 degrees at the bottom. But see, I got top dead center on 2 and 3 here. 1 and 4 at the bottom of their stroke. Let's just put a dab of paint on that mark to make it easier to see. I like red. Red works. Now I can see it when it's coming around to it and read the mark underneath the paint. The next job is to put the clutch on, and I have a whole new clutch. Let me show you. Here's the old clutch. Here's the driven disc, clutch disc, whatever you want to call it. And here is pressure plate and back. This clutch we always had problems with it. It got stuck a couple times and it engaged really harshly. So I decided that I would spend the money to just get a whole new clutch. This is a Rockford style clutch. This is probably I've only seen Rockfords in the tractors that I have. They made a couple different styles. But we've got a new driven disc here and new pressure plate assembly. The kit also came with the pilot bushing or bearing and throwout bearing, and it came with this nice little plastic clutch alignment tool to get everything in the right spot. This is handy. Before we put this onto the flywheel, there's some dimensions I want to check. Number one is the distance from, remember the step in the flywheel, where it bolts onto the flywheel here to the surface of the pressure plate, and it matches the old clutch. So we're in good shape there. Remember, Mr. Richards held that distance the same as what it was. The second distance we want to look at is the finger distance from the surface of the pressure plate, and I've got about 3 1/16, and on the new one I've got 3 1/16. Now the other thing you want to check is if these fingers are all the same, 3 1/16, so that they engage the throwout bearing at the same time. 3 1/16 and 3 1/16. So it looks like this clutch doesn't need any adjustment. It matches the dimensions of this old one. Put this together. First I'm going to spray down the friction plate here, whatever you want to call it, the flywheel, to get all the oil residue off of it. And then I can put my alignment shaft into the driven disc here. And this is really handy because the pilot bushing and the driven disc need to be in alignment for the tractor to push back together when I get the other half set up. Clean off the pressure plate, get any oil residue off of that, and then we can get this started on here. Make sure the holes line up. Yep. Now I got all the bolts in, I can start to draw this down. You can see there's a gap here. It's going to draw down, I don't know, probably 3/8 of an inch, and that represents the pressure that the pressure plate is putting on to the driven disc or the clutch disc via these springs here. They're holding down everything, keeping it together, and that's what makes a tractor move when the clutch is engaged. Disengaged, engaged. Tighten these down equally. Just of note, these ring gears can be swapped. Most of the time, we'll heat them up with Rosebud, Dad and I, so they expand a little bit, and then they push right off. You can flip it over and get the unworn edge, but this edge is barely worn, so I left it the way it is. You can let the next generation have the extra use out of the ring gear. Now we can pull our alignment tool out, and everything stays aligned down in there. Now the engine is all ready to mate up to the rear half. You just got to get her into position. She has to go up a bit. We got to twist her a little bit, get the alignment dowel started. We got to feel for the pilot bearing and the clutch shaft. What's really nice about these splitting stands, you can do fine adjustment with them to get things to line up. Just waiting for the right feel here. Are we hooked up? Yeah, rear axles are turning. We're definitely in. Alignment dowels down there are started in their holes, so I can start putting in the bolts, draw it together. 6 bolts hold the engine to the bell housing here. We got a couple up top. The new pilot bushing in here makes assembly tighter than it would be with an older pilot bearing. You need to be more on it, and when you draw it together, it should go together smoothly without a lot of resistance. If you run into a bind, you gotta take it back apart and see what's going on here. This one's going together fine. Top. Before I pull it off the hoist, I just want to make sure everything turns nicely. I've got it in 4th gear back there, so I'm looking for the axles to turn. And they are. That feels good. Let's check the clutch linkage here and make sure we got free play on the throwout bearing. That's the free play, and we'll adjust that via the clutch pedal linkage. It runs back from here, but this is the point at which the clutch starts to hit spring pressure. Good. And here it is, front to back, all together. Now we can start getting things ready to put the head on, and the first thing is to put studs back in the block. I chased all the holes with a tap. I ran these through a wire brush on the bench grinder, and I oil them up a little bit before I put them in. Just a light oil on these. These holes are all blind, none of them go through to the water jacket, so no worries about thread sealer. I know it's quite common on modern and more high performance engines, and particularly diesels, to replace the studs when you rebuild the engine. It's not typical on these old low compression Farmall engines. Studs are just fine to reuse unless there's some obvious problem with them. There were no problems with any of these. And then at the top of the studs where the head bolts go on and you torque everything down, they're fine thread. And I chase the threads on these with a die. I do it after they're on the engine because it's easier to hold them in place that way. Just cover up everything so none of the metal shavings get into things. This ensures that the head nuts go on smoothly. The next job is to install the cylinder head. Let's see what we have here. Looks nice. And this is the head gasket that came with my rebuild kit. It's classic, metal sandwich style. Made by Reliance. It has a note which side goes up, this side. And it goes on like this. I test fit it. Now, I went online because, I had problems with the head gasket on the MD, and that was a fiber head gasket, not a metal clad one like this. I went online looking for manufacturers' recommendations regarding gasket sealant on these. I couldn't find anything on Reliance. Nothing's ever included with the gasket kits as far as instructions, by experience anyway. I have always installed these metal clad gaskets with sealant on them. Used to use just plain old high-tack, Permatex high-tack for sealant, and now I use copper coat, and that's what I'm going to do with this one. I'm just going to put 2 light coats on here if the wind doesn't blow it all away, and let it set up a little bit between coats. And while the copper coat is setting up, clean all the oil off of the head here with lacquer thinner. We want a clean surface. The machinist who did my head, David Richards, planed the head, so I know I have a flat head. And there's a light texture on here to help grab to the head gasket. We're going to do the same with the top of the block. Clean any oil off of it with lacquer thinner. Get everything nice and spotless. My head gasket's set up. We'll put that on. And the head. Line up there, buddy. Give the ends of the studs a light brush of oil. Now, people debate everything in mechanics, and one of the things they debate is whether to oil things that are going to be torqued down, and my feeling is that oiling things helps things torque down evenly. I'm not as concerned about the exact torque on this as that it goes down evenly. So that's the rationale for oiling it. Boy, when you do YouTube videos about mechanics, you realize how many different opinions about things there are out there and how much people swear by their opinions. But we all do things a little differently for the most part. Start putting the head nuts on. Incidentally, these head nuts do have a top and a bottom. The bottom's got a smooth face here, which acts almost like a washer to keep the corners of the nut from digging into the metal to torque down better. And then the other side doesn't have that, so this side goes up. Torque on these is 65 foot-pounds, not very much. And we're going to do it in 3 steps, starting with 25 here. And you start at the center, and you work outward. Always, always. There is no torque sequence provided in the literature, which is pretty common for old engines. You just follow the normal standard practice, which is start from the center and work outwards. Then we'll take it to 45. And then finally to 65. I got all of 9 head bolts on this little engine. And then after tightening them all down, just go over them all again. Make sure they're where they need to be. And of course, after we get everything together and the tractor's running, we'll run it for a little while and then take it back apart and retorque the head nuts. Always do that. Next we want to get the rocker arms assembled here, and it's all in pieces. I took it apart because I had Dave Richards resurface where these go on the top of the valves because they'd worn in. Luckily, they all have a casting number on the side of them, and it turns out there's 2 of each casting number. And with my parts diagram here, I can see how it all goes together, and I've got the casting numbers listed under here. So we'll go ahead and put it together. I also have photos on my phone that I took before I took it apart, and that helps me too. Each of these have a different lean on them. A little assembly lube in these. And then we have this foot. That's a technical term, you know. Then we have this guy. Then a spacer. Then that guy. You guys got to stay all the same here. I like to be neat. You stay standing up. Little things you use as cues, like which way the slot in this is facing compared to my photo, so I know where it rode. And then this middle foot goes on, and that's where the oil supply is, goes up in here, and this tube is hollow and it's got oil holes on each side of these rocker arms. Now the last rocker goes on, and everything's under spring pressure here to hold everything tight, so we got a washer on the end, and then we have a snap ring. I just love snap rings. There, that was tons of fun. Now we can get everything mounted on top of the head. First come the studs that hold the valve train on, rocker arms and such. And this stud that goes in the middle is actually hollow, and it's got a hole here on the side of it. And oil comes up from the oil gallery down below, up through the head, through this hole, up through the hole in the stud, and feeds the center support for the rocker arms, and then through the tube, and that's how everything gets oil. Next, the push rods go in. I don't keep track of which hole these guys go in because they all get adjusted for valve lash. Put a little assembly lube where they seat into the tappet on the bottom. Put her in there. Put a little dab of lube on top of them. And a little bit on the tops of the valve stems. Now we can put the rocker arm assembly on. There's a slot in the shaft that has to line up inside of these holes here. So you got to turn everything to fit, or else it won't go over the bolts. Alrighty, here we go. Now it's time to adjust the valve lash up at the rocker arms, and this is the timing mark for the tractor. Right here, this little raised piece. This cover goes under here, and then you look through the hole in the bottom of the bell housing to see where your timing's at. So I gotta put it on. So if you look up from below in the bell housing here, you can see the flywheel back there, and there's the red paint that I put on the flywheel and the mark on the sheet metal behind it. And the mark aligns, so I'm at top dead center for pistons 1 and 4. The question is it the compression stroke? And to keep from crawling back under the tractor all the time, I got a little raised area on my pulley here. I'm just gonna make a pencil mark that lines up with it, so I know when at top dead center. So this would be top dead center for 1 and 4, and bottom of the travel for 2 and 3. We'll stick a finger in the plug hole and turn it around and see if it's on the compression stroke. Yep, that's compression stroke. Got my finger in the plug hole. Back around, top dead center. It's a little hard to tell because my valve lash is so messed up here. We just got to start adjusting and see if it comes back the right way. Gap is 014 14 thousandths hot, which in International Harvester terminology means room temperature. I'm way off here. I got a lot of adjustment to do. I got number 1 all adjusted. We'll try bringing it back around and see how it behaves. Now it should be coming up on the compression stroke. Stick my finger in the plug hole. Yep. So the deal on these 4 cylinders, these old IH engines, is you can adjust 1, 2, and 3, and 5 on top dead center of number 1, and then you turn it 360 degrees and you can adjust this one, this one, this one, this one, the rest of them. So 3 and 5. Run it around 360 degrees using the mark that I made on the pulley here. And then adjust the rest of the valves. That's all of them. Turn her over and see how everything works and sounds. That clicking is governor weights that are flopping around here. Of course, there's no spark plugs in it, so I'm not really getting compression. Turns very easy. Now it's time for the valve cover, and what I do is I coat one side of the valve cover gasket with high tack, and that side goes down. And by putting that gasket sealer on the downside, I form a little dam here in case any oil pools up against it. By not coating the top side, I make it so I can pull the valve cover back off without it sticking to readjust the valves. Valve cover goes on. These are copper crush washers, new ones, to make the seal where it bolts on. Don't tighten it down too much, it's a cork gasket. We're almost there. We're almost ready to paint. I've got parts coming to rebuild the governor. They'll be here in a couple days. I got to put the governor back together and put it on the front here to cover up this hole. And then I can mask everything off and we'll put some paint on this. We're really making progress. The main work on the engine is done. Now it's just accessories that go on. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you have a great day. I'll see you next time.